What did you do to my mother?
Why was that your first reaction?
I just knew. I knew they fought all the time and there were guns in the house.
Hi, my name is Madison, and you are listening to or watching or both Who's Knocking, a true crime podcast. Messy, messy, messy. Okay. Two things. One, hi, how are you? If you're new here, welcome. Please feel free to take a gander through a large collection of over, I think, 80 videos, and if you like what you see, please consider subscribing. If you have watched a couple videos and you haven't done that yet, please, that would be really, really great, and it would be extremely helpful. You can find me on Instagram at Who's Knocking Podcast, Twitter at Who's Knocking Pod, although I'm not the best on the Twitter. And you can email me, hello@whosknockingpodcast.com. I also have a newsletter. It is called Grim Weekly. You can find it at grimweekly.com. You can subscribe there and you can see old archived issues there. It's just a little fun little thing. I usually put that kind of stuff at the end, but I feel like not everyone gets to the end, so I figured I'd throw it in. Yeah. 2. The trial of Letitia Stauch just finished. I watched and listened to the entire trial, and I think I'm going to do a series on it. I really feel that she is the Casey Anthony of this decade, and I thought the trial was super important and fascinating for so many reasons. I won't get into it now because I know some people probably aren't interested, but I just have a lot of feelings on the matter, so I'm probably going to do it. Not next week, but maybe after that. Yeah. Okay. So I think we'll get into a little recap right now on part 1 of this series. This is a part 2, so if you just got here randomly, I would highly suggest part 1. Hopefully Aidan can put in a link right there. In part 1, we met Thomas Randolph, heartthrob and grade A mullet connoisseur. He was on wife number 6, Sharon, when all of a sudden she was killed after the two of them walked in on a robbery. The robber ended up shooting Sharon, and Thomas Randolph, being the hero that he was, grabbed one of his many guns sprinkled throughout the home and shot the robber to death, emptying the cartridge and killing this intruder. Turns out the intruder was a man named Mike Miller. Mike Miller and Thomas Randolph were very good friends. The whole scenario was really fishy from the start, and Thomas Randolph was very, very suspicious. So the detectives, Rob and Dean, began an investigation into Thomas, and they really got into things after the DAs were like, we don't have enough to charge him for the murder, like go back and find some more shit. So they went digging into Thomas Randolph's past. We started going through his wives in chronological order, starting with a woman named Catherine. They were married. It was his first wife. She's alive and well. His second wife, Becky, not a similar fate. She ended up dying, and it was believed that she had committed suicide, although 99% of people did not believe it was a suicide and believed that Thomas Randolph was responsible for her death. He was charged, he was tried, but was acquitted. So after that, he was able to get her life insurance policy that he had on her. And also he turned around and sued a bunch of counties and police departments for, I don't know if it was libel or defamation or whatever it was, but he made a lot of money off of Becky's death. And to this day, Becky's death has legally been deemed to be a suicide, and no one's buying it. We got through those two wives, and we will continue through the 6 wives and get to the rest of the story today. So buckle up. So Thomas Randolph's third wife was a woman named Leona Stapleton. Now they got married in 1994 and together they moved to Indiana. Now there's very little known about this marriage, but we do know that it only lasted for 11 months and ended in another divorce. Leona survived her marriage to Thomas Randolph, but she did go on to die of cancer 10 years later. So Leona has been counted as one of the 4 now deceased ex-wives of Thomas Randolph. However, it's almost definitely the case that she did not die at his hands. Again, we don't know too much about this marriage. There wasn't any relatives to speak to or anything for the detectives, but I think it's a pretty reasonable guess that the marriage went like all the other marriages, and it started off really well, really hot and heavy, got married right away, and then Thomas began to be himself, and Leona perhaps caught on to this very quickly, and very fortunately for her, and got the hell out of Dodge. That's what I would assume happened, but if anyone knows, please let me know in the comments. Now, after his split from Leona, Thomas Randolph again moved on with lightning speed. He met a woman named Gayna Allmon, and the couple were married in Indiana in 1995. Now, Gayna and Thomas met through a newspaper ad, which was the 90s equivalent to a dating website, which was the early 2000s equivalent to a dating app. Pretty much as soon as they were married, Thomas, of course, took out a life insurance policy on Gayna. It was only 1 month after they were married that he did this. I think it's clear that this man had a plan and he was sticking to it. Again, Thomas played his part. He was decently nice and cool in the beginning, but it did not take long for him to become his horrible, violent self. So one night, Thomas got into this big bar fight, this violent incident, and he was arrested. Now, Gayna was then contacted by a friend of hers who worked in the police department. Now, this person had become aware of Thomas's history after his arrest, and so he called Gayna to kind of probe her and to warn her, and he asked if Thomas had taken out any life insurance policies on her, which of course he had. And so this guy told her everything, everything about Becky and the last wife, Catherine, and everything. And it wasn't long after that information came to light when a very suspicious incident occurred in the Randolph home. So one day, Gayna was sitting in her living room with her loving husband, Thomas, who was sitting and polishing one of his many guns on the couch, when all of a sudden, the gun just went off accidentally and just missed Gayna by like a foot. Now, Thomas was shocked. He didn't even know the gun was loaded. After that incident, and after learning about everything, Gayna was quiet. She waited until he left for work, and then she quickly packed up her things and she ran. This was literally one of the murder scenarios that Eric Tarantino had mentioned when he was interviewed by the police. And it was later discovered that at the time, there was yet another man who Thomas had attempted to groom into murdering Gayna for him. Now, his story was identical to Eric Tarantino's, like to a T. This man, Glenn Morrison, even explained one of Thomas's plans. Go ahead and listen.
If I understand correctly what you were explaining to us about this whole plan that he had, that he proposed to you, he was trying to make it look like a robbery.
Yeah.
Where you came in
Right.
and forced him to open the safe,
Right.
and that you had shot the wife during this robbery, and then shot him in the leg.
Yeah, to make it
and
all
then
the
you
same.
stole the car.
Right.
As you were leaving.
Right. When he opened that safe, he had the gun in there too. If I did that, he'd shot me. And if she done shot, he don't need me no more. It'd be perfect alibi. No witnesses.
Does that sound familiar? This was the exact plan that it appeared Mike Miller had agreed to. The difference between Glenn and Mike was that Glenn had understood that in that scenario, there would be no reason for Thomas to keep him alive. Now, unfortunately for Mike, he maybe had more trust in Thomas Randolph. Perhaps Glenn's rejection of this plan had indicated to Thomas Randolph that he needed to up his game and come off as more trusting, or maybe he used harsher blackmail. Who knows? But you can see that, like most successful serial killers, Thomas was evolving and learning from his mistakes. At the same time, though, he was leaving a very large and obvious trail of evidence. Either way, in this instance, 2 intended victims survived Thomas Randolph's murder plots, and I'm sure he was not at all happy about it. So after Gayna, Thomas moved on to his 5th wife. Is that where? Yeah, we're at 5th. Frances Gaskins. Frances was a divorcee with a teenage daughter named Rachel from a previous marriage. And like the last few marriages Thomas was in, it was fast and furious. And the couple were married 6 months after they met each other. Now, same as the others, Frances's friends and family did not like the setup one bit. They felt that Thomas had pushed her into the marriage. I think the likelihood that they're correct about that is nearly 100%. When Frances had met Thomas, she was still not legally divorced from her last husband, and so Thomas pushed her through the divorce process as well as through the marriage process. He pretty much pushed her through everything. Now, Rachel said that things started out great with Thomas. He was a good stepdad to her, and she says that he spent time with her, that he signed her up for sports and taught her how to skate. And I don't think she had a whole lot of contact with her biological father, so I think this was a very big thing for both Rachel and Frances. Now, that to me is evidence that Thomas, he's a smart predator, right? He meets Frances and he's like, okay, the way to gain her trust is to be a good dad to her daughter, because that's who she cares about. And the way, like, as long as he is being a good dad to Rachel, all the other noise of her sisters and her friends saying that this guy is not a good guy is going to be nothing as long as she sees me being a good dad. That is predatory behavior, and that is what, like, finding a victim, honing in on them, learning what it is they want, and providing it. And that is how you gain people's trust. It's not hard. Rachel described her mother, Frances, as her best friend. She said that she was short and pretty and the sweetest person you'd ever met. And the two of them were very close. Pretty much all they had was each other. Now, this one differs quite a bit from the last few, but it's equally as fucked up. Maybe more. So, Frances had had a heart condition. It was not life-threatening at the time, and there was the surgery that she was eligible for, but apparently it wasn't super necessary at that point, but something that she was, maybe considering for the future. But Thomas, her loving new husband, began to insist that Frances undergo the surgery, probably thinking that he was genuinely concerned for her well-being. Frances agreed to get the surgery. Now, before the surgery, Thomas had Frances record this very disturbing video.
You want me to go ahead and do it now? And this is Frances Louise Randolph. And I'm making this tape so that people will know what I want for Rachel, for myself when I pass away. I would like for Tom to raise Rachel because he's a stepdad to her. And Tommy, I hope you never have to look at this tape because I hope we do it and put it away because I love you too much to think someday I will be it.
Asshole.
I love you, Tommy.
What do you want done with yourself?
And for my burial, I would like to be cremated and put along with Tom in a place. I don't want to be separated from him. So please, Tommy, do what you think is best because I know you do what's right for me.
Now, in hindsight, and especially given Thomas's history, that video is extremely ominous, and I think it gives a very clear indication of the premeditation in Thomas's actions, which we will get to. Frances had the surgery. By all accounts of the medical team, as well as Frances's family and friends, it had gone well. The surgery was a success, and there was nothing to indicate that she had any issues. Now, one day Rachel was visiting with Frances post-op. Everything was fine, and then husband of the year, Thomas Randolph, arrived to see his wife, and he asked Rachel if he could have some time alone with Frances. And Rachel was like, yeah, sure, that's no problem, and she stepped out of the room. a move I'm sure she had a very hard time dealing with and probably still does to this day. Now, within 45 minutes of Thomas Randall's arrival, Frances was dead. It was unclear what happened, but because it was post-surgery, Thomas, as next of kin, got to make the decision as to whether or not an autopsy would be performed on Frances. And what do you think he said? Nah. And then he had her cremated immediately because...
And for my burial, I would like to be cremated and put along with Tom in a place.
And then Thomas Randolph had the sheer audacity to run all over town claiming that Frances had died on the operating table. The balls on this man. It's unbelievable. And the icing on the cake. Thomas Randolph then turned around and successfully sued the hospital for her death and cashed out on the life insurance policy that he, of course, had on Frances. No one is sure exactly how much money he got out of the settlement, but Frances's sisters alleged that it could have been as high as $1.2 million. Just the suing, not the life insurance. Now give me a damn break. What some people get away with is disgusting. And it's unclear, with the Dateline episode or even some of the other footage that I found or other writings on Thomas Randolph, like how much of this is a law enforcement failure, I'm not exactly sure. I do think with the Becky case, it was because there was the main homicide detective in that case was like, this was not a suicide, but everyone else, in the police department was like, yeah, it was a suicide. And they let Thomas Randolph just come into the crime scene and take all his shit and clean up. So that for sure was a law enforcement failure in my humble opinion. This scenario, I don't know, like the hospital policy, like why are we letting next of kin, the guy who was with her last when she died, why are we letting him decide about an autopsy? Like, especially if it's in a medical setting, like, wouldn't you want to know, like, if there was something wrong with the surgery? Like, how, I just don't understand how that flew, like, why it was like, oh, the husband, the most likely suspect, if this was something suspicious, why would we not autopsy? Why is he given a choice? Maybe that's how things were or are still to this day, but that's not right. If anybody knows about this, I would love to know because that just does not sound correct to me. But you see this man get away with crime after crime after crime, and it's like, there's people in prison for so much less. So there was yet another unsuspecting family who were now left to pick up the pieces after Thomas Randolph rampaged their lives with his evil, psychotic need to suck the life out of others. He used Frances and her daughter Rachel. He took everything they had, everything he could get his grubby little hands on, and left nothing but tragedy and carnage after he moved on to the next one. Pure selfishness. Like, did Rachel get any life insurance policy? No, only Thomas. So after Frances, Thomas moved on to Sharon, and we already know how that one ended, unfortunately. So Dean and Thomas had spent about 4 months collecting all this backstory, traveling to state after state and meeting with family of the victims and figuring out this whole timeline that I just went through. They finally felt that they had enough to go back to the DA, and after seeing all of that, the DAs were like, fuck yeah, boys, let's get him. But instead of issuing a warrant for his arrest right away, they decided to play it a little bit safe by ordering a grand jury. I think the obvious reason for this was that all of the evidence that they did have was mostly circumstantial. A lot of circumstantial evidence, but circumstantial nonetheless. And I've explained grand juries before, but for those of you who may not have watched every single one of my videos, surely the minority of you, a grand jury is like a pre-trial, and it's not to decide on a person's guilt or not guilt, but rather to decide on whether or not a case has enough evidence to warrant a trial in the first place. Now, the day that Thomas Randolph went to go collect his property from Colleen's house, accompanied by multiple police officers and lawyers for both sides, Dean and Rob went there to serve a Markham notice, which is the notice of indictment for a grand jury. The charges were 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder against Sharon Randolph and against Mike Miller. When Thomas was served this notice, he tried to play it cool, but it was super satisfying for everyone else. 8 months after the murders of Sharon Randolph and Mike Miller, the jury came back with an indictment on Thomas Randolph. They finally had their arrest warrant. And so now it was time to bring him in. So Thomas was living with his mother in Clearfield, Utah at the time. So Rob and Dean went out there accompanied by a bunch of Clearfield police officers. There was a very big concern that things could get ugly, as they knew that Thomas was known for owning multiple weapons and being a bit of a hothead. So when Thomas answered the door, he refused to show one of his hands, which resulted in a very awkward and messy takedown involving a taser and Thomas in his underwear. Here's that.
Hello? Can I talk to you real quick? Put your hands on your head right now. Put your hands on your head right now. On your head. Keep on it. Watch it. Come out.
You could see that he kept his right hand behind the door frame, and he refused to show his hands.
Taser. Let me see. Taser. Go on the ground. On the ground.
Yes, my God. It touches me. Oh.
On the ground.
On your belly.
On your belly.
Ow. Ow.
Hands behind your back.
My hand. Oh, my God. Move. Ah, what are you doing?
You're under arrest.
I understand it. Oh, oh, Jesus. Oh.
Both hands up. Let's get him up. Let's get him moving. Get him out.
God. Oh, my
Stand up and walk.
You can't. Oh.
Let's get him out of the house.
Oh.
Walk.
Can't let me do this crime. This way.
Walk.
Oh,
Walk.
Jesus.
Really quick. Walk, all right? Walk it slow. Let's walk.
Oh, Jesus. Oh.
Kind of gross to watch for many reasons. And thank you, Dateline, for being there to capture all of this. And I'll just say, no one was more relieved about Thomas's arrest than Colleen, of course, who now had a newborn baby who was grandmotherless and a toddler. Now, this trial would be a death penalty case, so pretty big deal. So Thomas Randolph hired a man named Gabe Grasso to be his what would be first defense attorney. Now, the reason that Randolph hired this guy specifically was because he had just finished representing O.J. Simpson in his robbery trial. Remember, he had the big robbery thing in Vegas, I believe. Now, remember, Thomas Randolph had a thing for the whole O.J. affair. Remember, he thought that he should have been on the Dream Team? Just let that sit with you. I think it's very clear why he looked up to OJ, and I think he really hoped that his murder trial would go very similarly to OJ's murder trial. Now, Grasso knew that his 2 main challenges for this case would be, 1, the fight with the prosecution about how much of Randolph's past they would be allowed to introduce. That's always a fight, and obviously the state would want as much of that as possible let in. As that is most of their circumstantial evidence. And number 2, Thomas Randolph had a big fat mouth. This man loved to talk. He loved to give interviews. His own personality would be his downfall if Grasso could not keep him quiet. Grasso knew that the prosecution would do everything they could to squeeze a confession out of him, whether through jailhouse snitches or undercovers, whatever. The case lacked a confession. Also, Thomas was just a very annoying client, so having to work with this guy was just brutal. Honestly, poor Gabe. But eventually, Gabe had to withdraw from the case because Thomas Randolph couldn't pay him. So, Randolph had to go with a public defender. I wonder what he spent all of his money on, because he had a lot at one point. Now, it took 9 years from Randolph's arrest to get to the actual trial. He was one of, if not, the longest held prisoner in that jail pre-trial. Once it actually began, it was the shit show that everybody expected. First of all, He emerged looking like this.
Randolph doesn't even look like the same man he was at the time of Sharon's death. At age 62, overweight, pale, and with his long white hair tied in pigtails, he is barely recognizable. And some even mistake him for a woman as he steps forward to profess his innocence.
I see you, Crime Watch Daily. That was shady as hell, but I'm here for it. Now, apparently the judge ordered him to cut his hair. Personally, I don't know why that would be necessary, but I don't know. Thomas Randolph, of course, testified on his own behalf. Of course. And he was just as annoying and narcissistic as ever. Here he is being a huge dick to the judge right out the gate. Probably why she made him cut his hair.
When I talked to the other attorneys, they said, all you're gonna do is piss her off. You're gonna make her look stupid, make her look silly, whatever. And then she's just gonna hold it against you. Well, you're not supposed to hold anything against me because you're fair. You're a good judge.
I bet the fact that he had a female judge was super aggravating for him. He obviously has zero respect for women, so it's pretty hilarious that one of the prosecutors and the judge were both women, and he had to just sit there and listen to them. Thomas Randolph and his team pretty much had to stick to his original story because the walkthrough video was still in play, and they had to go with that as his exact version of events. The defense argued that this whole thing was a completely circumstantial case, so obviously lots of reasonable doubt. Now, what did happen at the trial was the introduction of all of Thomas Randolph's previous relationships, all the life insurance policies and the other money collected and Francis's will video, etc. So it looks like the prosecution had gotten their way with all of their motions to include all of this stuff. The jury did not seem to have a very difficult time coming back with a guilty verdict on all charges, and the death penalty was swiftly invoked. Everyone was thrilled. Finally, after all of these years, this horrible, vile serial killer was convicted and was set to be killed by the state. Now, the death penalty is a controversial topic. I get that. But many agree that if anybody should be getting the death penalty, if it's going to be in play, Thomas Randolph is a reasonable candidate. I'd have to say I agree. But the thing about death penalty cases is, in theory, appeals are taken pretty seriously. And appeal Thomas Randolph did. And a few years after his conviction, one of his appeals was successful. In December of 2020, his conviction was reversed pending a new trial. Now, the judges who ordered this reversal did so on the grounds that the prosecution should not have been allowed to include information about Becky's death because Thomas had technically been acquitted for that charge. However, Thomas did have to remain in prison, and to this day, Thomas Randolph remains in prison awaiting his new trial. He's now had over 25 lawyers, I'm pretty sure all of them public defenders, and he has been locked up for 14 long years. He still to this day, just annoying as ever.
This is nonsense. I want the hell out of here. And I know when these lawyers see what there is to see, they're going to file the appropriate motions, and they're going to ruin your day, and they're going to ruin the state's day, because then you are going to grant these motions that they file, and I'm going home. It's that simple. But it's not going to happen until they come and see me, till they have access to me. I've been waiting 14 years. I've had 25 attorneys. It's getting old. So you have to step up and make these people do what they need to do.
And that was Thomas Randolph speaking to a judge. And to be fair, the system in which he finds himself sounds frustrating as hell, sure, especially since all of this kind of happened during COVID and there was a lot of issues getting to speak to his lawyers, etc. But I don't know, maybe next time you kill a bunch of people, you should maybe think about that, because I don't think anybody feels bad for this man. Now, I will remain on top of his trial and proceedings and update you on his whereabouts. I hope that he gets a fair trial, but I do hope that he spends the rest of his days cut off from all of society if he survives. I think it's obviously super upsetting for all of the victims' families that this is still not over, and there is still absolutely a chance that he will walk free. Always there's a chance of that. I would not put it past this man. He's gotten so many chances. But at least he is locked up at the present time. Now, what are the takeaways from this case? I wanted to touch a little bit on this. This was a situation in which a normal-ish seeming guy waltzed around tricking women and completely victimizing them, using them, taking everything from them, and killing them. That's pretty intense. But I think this is a situation that I'm sure many people could find themselves in just by sheer luck. These predator-type people, and yes, they can be women too, they know how to choose their victims. In Thomas's case, he specifically looked for middle-aged women, many of whom were divorced or who had children already, were online dating, probably kind of lonely and looking for a serious partner. A lot of people, I think, really do not understand or realize just how easy it is to pretend to be a good person. It's unbelievably easy to appear to be anybody that you want, really. If you really try, it's super simple to meet a person, get to know them a little bit, figure out exactly what they're looking for, and provide it. I mean, these women, a lot of them he found on dating websites or in newspaper ads, like they're very explicitly saying what they want. Once you are a woman and you're, getting up there, like most of us are gonna say, this is what we want and put it out pretty plainly. And so it's easy to just pretend to be that. And that's how you disarm somebody and then go for the kill when they least expect it. And you obviously have to be a pretty awful person to do that, but awful people exist. I don't know if any of you guys have seen Dirty John, but this is essentially the same story, and I think it's pretty common. And, we all have that friend who's maybe a little bit too naive or too trusting, the person that says, I just always want to see the best in people. And in a way, I've always been jealous of that type of person. I mean, it must be kind of nice to live like that. Like, I just feel like it must be nicer in your head. But that is also the type of person who is the perfect target for a guy like Thomas Randolph. And I will say this, look out for red flags, easy on the life insurance, and if multiple people in your life do not like him, maybe take their concerns seriously. It's never anybody's, I'm not trying to blame victims for their behavior. It's not your, nothing is an invitation to be completely robbed of everything in your life, including your own life. But whether we like it or not, predators exist, and it's important to be diligent. And, stories like this, where we see multiple people have lost their lives over it, I think it's important to look at these stories, take them seriously, and apply it to your own life. So that's the story of Thomas Randolph. And again, it's not over. I will definitely have my Google alerts for this man and keep up, and I'll let you know. And please take this story seriously. Watch out for red flags. Watch out for red flags for your friends, and stay safe, because you never know who's knocking. This podcast is produced in collaboration with Lost Line Media. Artwork by August Digital. Music by Matthew Cook.